So you want to defend pop punk? Why? There is always talk of pop punk having little artistic merit, and as long as the genre is around, there always will be. Even the two words that make up the genre's name are completely antithetical to each other. But when people say something like pop punk sucks, I'm not really even tempted to argue with them. There are some major gaping flaws in the genre that totally make sense for someone to criticize. And there are cliches and things in pop punk that just aren't going to be for everybody. The subject matter of even the most well-received pop punk albums are divisive at best when put in front of a larger audience. Sadness, depression, anxiety, scornfulness, whininess, these are all things that are just unpleasant for a lot of people to listen to. Or even that kind of vulnerability in a song just makes them cringe. And I don't really have any interest in trying to convince them that pop punk is actually good. What I think pop punk needs defending from actually is the discourse and propaganda online that pop punk is dead. It might not be as alive as it used to be. For a moment, ever so brief, it had its time in the sun. Radio play, platinum records, massive, exciting tours. I'm of course talking about the 90s and 2000s when bands like The Offspring, or Green Day, or Blink-182. They were all enjoying a massive upswing in popularity, like on MTV, or just selling out concert tickets. But it wasn't long before bands that were essentially doing exactly what Green Day was doing weren't going to sell records, weren't going to sell out concerts, weren't going to be rock stars. That time had passed. They were all locked in the metaphorical broom cupboard, destined for obscurity, barely scraping by. Was it because they're not bringing anything new to the table? Just further drying out the stale loaf of a genre that is pop punk? Everyone keeps pulling me aside and saying pop punk isn't innovating. It's dead. All the bands sound the same. Stop bringing this up at Thanksgiving dinner. So the sun has set on the massive popularity of the genre, and pop culture has moved, as it always does, to something else. Enter the 2010s, the so-called pop punk renaissance that is a meager fart in the wind compared to the heaping pile of golden shit that was the 2000s pop punk gilded age. And yet it was the gas that kept the embers from going out. The pop punk renaissance produced some genre-defining albums that to this day are regarded, for the most part, as actually good. Albums like Under Soil and Dirt, The Greatest Generation, The Finer Things, Contender, 61 Pen, Worry, to name a few. And with many of those albums approaching or even passing their 10th anniversaries, we find ourselves in a time where pop punk is once again being declared dead. But it's not. We all just grew up. These bands grew up. They don't hate their hometown anymore. They've more or less figured out how to have a healthy relationship with others. Life makes a little more sense now that they've found their place in the world. They've grown up. Life isn't as confusing now. But what happens when the current youth grows up? New youth takes their place. Circle of life, baby. Ka is a wheel. There are always new bands coming into the scene. 20-somethings who grew up listening to the same bands that a lot of us did. Now they're making their own music, influenced by that sound, but tweaking it and refining it into something new. It's not always fresh, but at least it's their own. When we sit around and say that pop punk is dead, we're selfishly claiming that the buck stops where our own nostalgia glasses end. We arrogantly think that pop punk died when ourselves and our favorite bands grew up. And anybody trying to be the next Blink-182 shouldn't even bother. To that I say, have you heard what Blink-182 has been releasing lately? Maybe they do need a reboot. And refusing to listen to some of these newer bands in a genre that you think peaked years ago means you're gonna miss out on some serious gems that are being released. Like, sure, this isn't pop punk, but if you thought grunge was dead, you would never listen to a band like this, Superbloom, who released Pollen. Sure, Superbloom sounds a lot like Nirvana, but damn did I miss this sound, and this is an excellent release. And sure, something like that isn't exactly new, but it is a very well-refined and well-executed take on something that has, to a large extent, already been done. Does that make it bad? I don't think something has to be new and groundbreaking just to be considered good. Pop punk isn't dead. It may have fallen out of vogue in pop culture. The spotlight has shifted, but the wheel turns. The scene still has a heartbeat. Bands like Action Adventure, bands like Arm's Length are gaining new popularity, releasing debut LPs to great acclaim, and I personally think that they're excellent debuts. Legacy bands like State Champs, I know they're not that old. Legacy bands like State Champs or The Story So Far, The Wonder Years continue to release albums that I think are still pretty good. They don't sound like they're on their last legs yet. Even the real legacy bands, people are still going to give me crap for calling these guys legacy bands. The Offspring, Blink-182, Green Day, Sum 41, all these bands are still releasing new music, selling out concert tickets. I mean, look at the Blink-182 fiasco. There is still interest in this genre. Doesn't sound dead to me. At this point, pop punk is so broad that it's impossible to nail down who's real pop punk and who isn't. It's like trying to define what's real emo. It's kind of a pointless endeavor. But a lot of these bands that are probably on the fringe of pop punk, like Turnover, for example, still has clear influences from the genre that they grew up in. They're still going on tours with bands like The Story So Far. Again, doesn't sound dead to me. And I know it's pointless to try and convince people that pop punk is good, actually. It's a personal preference, and that's an opinion that I'm fine with. This just happens to be a genre that speaks to me. So why defend pop punk? What am I defending pop punk from? I just want to defend it from claims that pop punk has died. I feel like that makes it seem like pop punk isn't even worth exploring anymore. It's not worth going to shows or trying to discover new bands. And calling pop punk dead does a disservice to bands like Goalkeeper or my personal hometown favorite, Annie Jump Cannon, who are playing in stinky venues to small crowds, who are grinding and performing music that they love. It minimizes the impact that those bands have on their fans. And I think those bands are worth discovering and promoting, and they're new in the pop punk genre. And that's the meaning I find in defending pop punk. It's to show that pop punk still has a heartbeat. If you love this type of music, there are still new bands that you can find, new albums to fall in love with, discoveries to be made, shows to go to in your hometown or close to you. If the sound of that makes you curious or excited, then welcome to the channel. I'm glad you're here. Thanks for watching.